You found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Normally I try to be at least minimally restrained in these videos, and I try to keep it restricted to just the scientific claims. Today, that's going to change a bit. You see, today I'm covering an audio recording of a talk given by Casey Luskin of the Center for Science and Culture, an organization which is, in my opinion, a Christo-fascist pseudoscience propaganda mill aimed at making sure that women and LGBTQ people suffer to the benefit of cis-straight Protestant Christian, mostly white men, and they're perfectly happy with supporting a dictatorial autocracy if that'll get them there. Now, you might think that's a pretty big claim, and to be fair, it is. Let's take this chronologically. In approximately 2008, an internal document from a Discovery Institute called the Wedge Document was leaked, showing that the purpose of the Discovery Institute broadly, and the Center for Science and Culture in particular, was specifically to introduce and push Christianity in schools and government and public life broadly. This was in furtherance of a goal of creating a Christian nation. This also showed that the facade of the DI as a non-religious group of scientists all just looking at the flaws in modern biology was just that, a facade. Fast forward to the lead up to the 2024 election and Project 2025, which is an outline for a Christian nationalist takeover of the federal government by autocratic mechanisms in a United States where the president had already been declared to be above the law, and a known insurrectionist was being unconstitutionally allowed to run for the office of president, and being counted on by Christian dominionists to take over and get rid of pesky things like the First Amendment, despite himself being a known serial adulterer and rapist, something that Christians generally at least pretend to be against. While the plan and document were primarily the result of the Heritage Foundation, when one checked to see who was helping build out their plan for a neo-fascist United States, the Center for Science and Culture was right there, up until the last few months of the election at least, at which point their name was removed for reasons unknown. It is with this background of existential threats to my loved ones, for which Casey Luskin is partially but directly responsible, that I make this video. I know, I promise not to get too political in my videos, but I do not accept the premise that arguing about which people deserve human rights is political. The answer is all of them, with the only exception being those who don't think all of them is a good answer. This includes Casey Luskin. That is not a political statement. That is a statement of minimal moral principle. If you want me to tell you what I think the marginal tax rate should be on unrealized capital gains, then tough, I'm not here to talk about that. That is political. Whether or not we should withhold life-saving and routine medical care from people who are about to turn septic because their dying fetus couldn't be removed isn't political. Asking whether or not people should die of easily preventable diseases like measles, mumps, or rubella isn't political. Whether or not people deserve to be allowed to live their lives, work their jobs, and love whom they will regardless of their sexuality or gender identity isn't political. If that makes Luskin or Gunter Beckley think I'm deplorable, then I don't care. Because they seem to not care about the human suffering they impose. So frankly, I want them to have a poor opinion of me. Basically, this video is me getting that baggage off my chest, and hopefully, after I'm done with this Luskin talk, I can go back to my kindler, gentler, more charitable self. But boy, do I need to get all of this out there at least once. All that being said, believe it or not, this video is actually about human evolution. So, I guess, here's the guy I'd call a living pile of shit, if it weren't such an insult to shit.
So this talk is going to be in three parts. We're first going to talk about fossils, then we're going to talk about genetics, then we're going to talk about psychology in the human mind, and how all of these point to intelligent design.
So as an intelligent design advocate, rather than a more traditional creationist, Luskin doesn't really care much about things like the age of the Earth, and even is willing to accept, at least for the sake of argument, much more common ancestry than most creationists. That being said, he, like most creationists, can't really have humans with common ancestry with other primates. Because the whole idea of intelligent design being secular is just an obvious lie. Luskin is actually motivated to keep humans the special boys of the universe, because the Bible seems to indicate that they are. So basically the whole motive for this is Casey's theology, that he likes to lie about, because remember, the whole reason for the existence of the Discovery Institute is to trick people into accepting pseudoscientific garbage as a pretext to getting them to support a dystopian Christian theocracy.
Rather than an evolutionary origin of the human species. So, what is the evolutionary view of human origins?
It's basically that humans shared a common ancestor with the chimpanzee species some 6 or so million years ago, and that they evolved from a population that started to specialize as a predator in open grasslands and areas of broken forests in East Africa. As a result of this new niche, they began to walk upright and gain different thermoregulation mechanisms than other apes, as well as started to gain increasing brain size and cognitive ability, allowing them to advance their technology and the sophistication of their social groups through time. Obviously, that leaves a lot out, but I suspect we'll be getting into the details shortly.
So the standard evolutionary view starts about 5 to 7 million years ago, where supposedly we shared our most recent common ancestor with apes, namely chimpanzees.
Well, that's almost right, but it's not that humans share a common ancestor with apes. Humans are apes in the taxonomic sense, which is the relevant sense here, and their most recent common ancestor with any non-human extant apes is about that long ago. Even in framing it this way, Luskin is sneaking in the idea that humans are separate from apes. He's priming his audience to be sympathetic to his position even before he states it.
And some of the earliest hominins here on the bottom left, but would be these early species that were supposed to be some of the first upright bipedal species that were walking on two legs like we do today.
Sorry for the lack of visuals. All I could find was this audio recording.
After them came a genus of ape-like hominids called the Australopithecines.
Presumably, that means that the ones he's indicating before are organisms like Ardipithecus and Sahelanthropus. I'm honestly not sure why they didn't just record video, or at least put up what seemed to be Luskin's slides, but instead all I got was a static image of a sunflower covered in lots of text. Oh well, at least this animation that I've made is showing Luskin in an appropriate light.
And this is supposed to be our direct evolutionary ancestors. These are supposed to be very small ape-like creatures that had a chimp-like head, but supposedly they walked upright just like we do.
There's no supposedly about it. We have their skeletons, and while no one specimen is complete, we have so many that we can reconstruct a full Australopithecus afarensis or africanus skeleton with really no speculation. They were physically incapable of walking like a chimp and have all the adaptations to bipedality that humans have, even though they have them in different degrees. This includes the valgus knee, arched feet, the shape and orientation of the pelvis, lumbar lordosis, and a ventral placement of the foramen magnum. They're as plausibly reconstructed as a biped as this moa is.
And there's supposed to be evidence that basically the human-like body plan was coming into existence. And then finally, around 1 to 2 million years ago, you have the genus Homo appearing. Of course, we are the species Homo sapiens. In Latin, it means wise man. And our body plan appears in the fossil record. And according to the evolutionary story, these Australopithecines are supposed to be our direct evolutionary ancestors.
That's not entirely uncontroversial, but yeah, it does seem like if you were to trace humans back, it would lead to a species of Australopithecus. Although not necessarily one of the currently known ones.
So what I'm going to talk about today is the fact that the fossil record shows a large unbridged gap between ape-like fossils and human-like fossils in the hominid fossil record, and this comes directly from the mainstream scientific literature.
So he's going to lie to us. No surprise there.
And the record does not document the evolution of humans from ape-like species.
Weird how essentially no paleoanthropologists have noticed that. Pro tip. If all the experts say you're wrong, that doesn't necessarily mean you're wrong, but chances are you are wrong. Chances are you, as some random-ass guy on the internet, didn't notice something that all the people who dedicate their lives to the relevant field of study just happened to miss. Also, I suppose I should point out that the species aren't really ape-like, they're just apes. They're ape-like in the same way a wolf and a jackal are both canine-like. They just are canines.
So I like to, when I first talk about this topic, talk about the field of paleoanthropology, this field that basically studies human origins.
Well, at least he didn't say the word is too hard to say and just decided to call it the field and to call paleoanthropologists paleo-experts, like happened in Contested Bones.
And what's interesting about the field of paleoanthropology is that it is a very fragmented field. And I like to say that it's fragmented in multiple senses.
Why do I get the feeling that all that means is that, like in all fields of science, there are open questions and people with strong opinions on multiple sides of those questions? You know what paleoanthropologists don't differ on, though? That the hominins we have now are in fact apes that are more closely related to humans than they are to chimpanzees. That they represent morphological intermediates between the morphology of Miocene apes and modern humans, and that the work of paleoanthropology is uncovering information about the evolution of humans from their common ancestor with chimpanzees.
Number one, the fossils themselves are fragments. Stephen Jay Gould, famous Harvard paleontologist, said that most hominid fossils are basically scraps of jaws and fragments of skulls.
Yep, That's pretty standard for paleontology. Intact bones are rare, let alone intact skeletons.
But the record is also fragmented in space and time. I love this quote from University of Chicago evolutionary biologist Jerry Coyne. He says, paleoanthropology is a field in which the students far outnumber the objects of study. Okay? This tells you just how few fossils they have to work with.
No, it doesn't. It just tells you that the number of paleoanthropologists is larger than the number of fossils, which doesn't tell us either number. If I say x is greater than y could be any finite number. It could be 3. It could be 10 to the power of 100 trillion. I also don't see what this has to do with anything. We still have hundreds of fossils of dozens of species, all of them showing various mosaic traits between Miocene apes and modern humans, making all of them transitional and evidence not just for the common ancestry of humans and other apes, but evidence for how that transition happened.
But then also the field itself is fragmented. This is a quote from a PBS Nova producer.
So, not a paleoanthropologist. Look, I already really don't care about random quotations, even from experts. I super don't care about whoever the hell this guy is. I'm skipping his quote. It literally could be anything, and I wouldn't care. Because it's not only unsourced, which will become a theme, but the source isn't even one that would provide evidence if the source were provided. I might as well tell you what my mom, the school secretary, thinks about the matter.
They're constantly disagreeing with each other.
Obviously, that's what it means for a field to be active. If the scientists didn't disagree, it would mean that there was nothing new to learn in the field of paleoanthropology. But what they don't disagree on is that the evidence from both genetics and the fossil record is overwhelming that humans are apes, and that known hominins are both closer to humans than any other apes, including chimps, and that known hominins document the actual history of the morphological changes from the common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans through to modern Homo sapiens. Think about this in another field. Physicists disagree with each other all the time. They argue about various interpretations of quantum physics, for example, how quantum information is or isn't conserved at the event horizons of black holes, or how best to investigate quantum gravity, or what symmetries might be broken, etc. But with Luskin's logic, then what we should conclude from that is that physics isn't real, and that the universe is just a sea of chaos with no consistent rules to how things work. Or to take it to history, historians will argue endlessly over the relative importance of various factors involved in any event, such as the fall of Rome. How important was Rome's monetary policy, their hiring of Germanic mercenaries, the need for land reform, etc.? But what these disagreements don't mean is that the Western Roman Empire is still in operation, and that the EU is a usurpation of proper imperial authority. The parts of a scholarly field that are disagreed about are the parts that are still under active investigation. If everyone in a field already agrees with a particular conclusion, that means it's not under investigation. All Luskin is saying is that paleoanthropology is a field in which we're still learning.
I really like this quote from Nature editor, senior editor Henry Gee. He says that the fossil evidence of human evolutionary history is fragmentary and open to various interpretations.
Right, but it's not open to any interpretation. I'd be hard-pressed to think of any dataset that isn't open to more than one interpretation. As a specific example, there are debates about Australopithecus afarensis, the species to which Lucy belonged. There is disagreement about how much time they spent in trees, where they actually are in the tree of hominin evolution, etc. But you know what there isn't any disagreement over? Whether they were bipeds on the ground. They absolutely were, and there are no data that contradict this. And all the available data are either not dispositive, or are contradictory to any non-bipedal interpretation for A. afarensis. I don't know how many times I need to say this, but disagreement in a field doesn't mean that the universal consensus in that field is invalid.
Now, of course, he's a full-blown evolutionist, right? So when he says open to various interpretations, he's talking about evolutionary interpretations.
Well, no one has ever put forth an interpretation of biology that contradicts evolution broadly and actually has evidence, so of course he does.
But what I want to put forth is, if the evidence really is so fragmentary, then why are non-evolutionary interpretations fully disallowed in the mainstream paleoanthropological community? I think there is plenty of room for non-evolutionary views, and quite suspiciously, those are totally denied by the mainstream scientific community. They're never, ever allowed.
They are allowed, though. It's just that none of them actually pass muster. It's the same reason we don't see flat Earth geocentrism in cosmology papers. It's not that there's a rule against it, it's just that no flat earther has ever managed to actually provide evidence that would be compelling, and instead they say things that are so off-the-wall insane that the proper venue for them is a diary in a mental health ward rather than the pages of Nature. Anti-evolution is in the same boat. Every argument for it is a fallacious joke. Not a single valid reason has ever been given to doubt things like universal common ancestry for cellular life, or morphological change in populations over time, or changes in allele frequencies over generations.
But I think the evidence, if we're to look carefully, follow the evidence where it leads, and let truth guide us, I think there's plenty of room. In fact, I think the best explanations are non-evolutionary ones.
Then why are anti-evolutionists constantly lying? If creationists actually had evidence, they would provide it. Instead, we get things like lying about what rocks are made of, lying about the anatomy of paleotaxa, lying about genetics, even creating entire computer programs specifically so that they support the lie. I even see creationists lying about Mars of all things.
So let's first get into the Australopithecines. As I said earlier, the Australopithecines were a genus of ape-like hominids.
Hominidae is a family in the superfamily Hominoidea. Hominoidea are the apes. If it's a hominin, it's a member of Hominidae, which means it's a member of Hominoidea, which means it's an ape as ape could be. If you want to see something that's ape-like, go look at a baboon. It's like an ape in many ways, but it's not an ape. Australopithecus is a genus of ape. It's not ape-like. Homo is a genus of ape. It's not ape-like. Sure, in casual speech we can exclude humans or hominins from the group ape, but we're not talking casually. We're talking about evolution and taxonomy. In that case, we don't get to use these words casually, and calling Australopithecus ape-like is just wrong.
That are supposed to be the direct ancestors of our genus Homo.
It's a strong possibility, but it's not conclusive, and it probably never will be. But what they definitely are is a group of animals who retain many basal traits from early apes, such as prognathism in the face, a relatively small brain, heavy brow ridges, a close to box-shaped tooth row, long arms, etc. And it also has many derived traits, like lumbar lordosis, a ventral foramen magnum, valgus knees, foot arches, iliac blades that can support bipedal locomotion, etc. This is a confirmation of the predictions that the idea of humans being apes makes. Regardless of whether any known Australopithecus species is directly ancestral to humans or not, their existence as intermediates between basal apes and derived humans is evidence of human evolution.
Their name literally means southern ape. They lived between 1.9 and 4.5 million years ago. They had a brain and body. They were about the size of a chimpanzee.
That's true.
But the big story here is that they supposedly were beginning to walk upright, much like modern humans do.
That's not just a story. Their skulls, spines, hips, knees, and feet are all exclusively compatible with human-like bipedal terrestrial locomotion. There are no other options that are open to us, and that's one of the reasons that this isn't really one of the things paleoanthropologists disagree on anymore. Sure, as is expected, there was some dissent at least initially to this idea among workers in the field, but there really isn't anymore.
And one of the most complete and most famous specimens of Australopithecines, of course, is Lucy, a member of the species Australopithecus afarensis. But very little of her skull was found. So I find it so interesting that when you go to all of these science museums, they have reconstructions of Lucy, as we see here. These are all supposed to be reconstructions of Lucy. And in each of these reconstructions, she's like staring up at the sky, like she's having her first glimmer of thought, or she's smiling. This is, of course, sheer imagination and fiction. I mean, these reconstructions of these fossils are not based upon hard evidence. In Lucy's case, we don't even have a whole lot of her skull.
Oh man, it's a good thing we have AL444-2, a nearly complete male Australopithecus afarensis skull from the same area as Lucy, which confirmed earlier reconstructions based on more fragmentary remains. Of course, that was found in 1992, which means Luskin is lying here when he pretends that the reconstructions of A. afarensis faces are based on insufficient skull material. Oops. Also, for those of you who like the Dapper Dinosaur creationism drinking game, yes, this is an ad hominem argument.
Certainly we don't have evidence that she was smiling and looking up at the sky, pondering the meaning of her existence. So,
yeah, that interpretation of the reconstruction is only in Luskin's stunted and perverted brain. It's not a real thing. His paranoia is showing.
This is very much evolutionary interpretation, so be very skeptical when you see reconstructions of hominid fossils.
Sorry, but Casey Luskin lying in service of his paranoid delusions aren't a cause to be suspicious of reconstructions of paleotaxa.
But one of the points I like to make about the Australopithecines is although they are supposed to be our evolutionary ancestors, many Australopithecine traits are ape-like and or not human-like.
Oh good, we're about to hear how Australopithecus are too transitional to be transitional. That'll be a cogent argument. See what I mean about anti-evolutionists not being in journals, not because they're barred, but because they don't actually have any good points, arguments, or evidence? Yeah, this kind of argument exemplifies that.
I'm talking about their arms, their chest, their striding gait, their shoulders, their abdomen, their inner ear canals, which are actually very important for the way you walk, right? If you ever had an inner ear infection, it affects your balance. Well, they had inner ear canals that were similar to apes, not to humans.
So this basically comes down to the orientation of the semicircular canals. These are bits of your inner ear that are filled with fluid, but that also have small solid bits that react to whatever forces are accelerating the body, whether it be gravity or the acceleration of a rocket or sports car. Essentially, they tell you which way down is and how hard down is pulling on you, even when down is more the result of physical acceleration through space than gravity. Although gravity is also in a real sense accelerating you, but this is about biology, not relativity, so we'll ignore that for now. Anyway, most apes spend a lot more time in trees than humans do, whereas humans spend a lot more time running on two legs, and their respective semicircular canals reflect that. So that means that because humans are very derived in terms of locomotion, their semicircular canals should be divergent, which also means that if humans and chimps share a common ancestor, then the semicircular canals of that animal would have to be much more chimp-like than human-like, since the human condition is the derived condition. Of course, if we're looking at human ancestry, we should expect that those animals closer to the common ancestor of chimps and humans should retain more basal traits and have fewer derived traits. Turns out that this is one of them, and it also means that Australopiths probably spent more time in trees than modern humans. None of this is unexpected or a problem for evolution. It also does not negate the derived traits that Australopithecus share with humans, in places like hips, knees, and feet. Luskin is just complaining that Australopithecus is too transitional to be transitional.
Their developmental patterns, their toes, their teeth, and their hand bones, and their brain size were all ape-like and are not human-like. So
this is basically all lies. Developmental patterns are hard to study, but all apes have broadly similar developmental patterns, including humans. Humans just basically have them stretched out farther because of the more extensive parental care. Their toes are in line like a modern human and are far more like those of a human than those of any other ape. Their teeth are in fact intermediate between humans and other apes, with a subparabolic shape to the tooth row and reduced canines that are not as small as in humans, but which are much smaller than they are in other apes. Their hand bones are actually quite human-like, but human hands are actually extremely basal. Human hands are extremely similar to those of the earliest apes in the fossil record, and most other extant apes actually have had far more changes to their hands. The hand bones of Australopiths are essentially the same as humans, although they are often curved more, but it's not obvious if that's a result of behavior or not. Human gymnasts who perform routines on the high bar also typically have curved hand bones. The brain size is the one place where he's basically correct. Australopiths did not have exceptionally large brains for apes.
I think there's a lot of evidence that they were very different from modern humans.
Yes, they were, although it's not nearly so much as Luskin would have us believe. But no one I'm aware of has ever said that they were not very different from modern humans. In fact, if they weren't, then rather than being a transitional species, they'd just be modern humans. In order for them to be transitional, they have to be different.
Now, what about Lucy being this small-brained, bipedal or upright walking ape? Is that true?
Yes, it is the universal consensus in the field and supported by every available line of evidence, from skull shape to hip shape and orientation, to femur shape to knee angles to foot morphology, to the actual tracks we have of them. Every single line of evidence points towards bipedal locomotion on the ground and contradicts knuckle walking.
Well, yes, I think it is true that she was small-brained, but the nature of the bipedality, the nature of the way that she walked, and the way that she's basically what her lifestyle was, is very controversial.
It's controversial in the way that the shape of the Earth is controversial, or who won the 2020 presidential election is controversial. There are those people who are not crazy, who know it's a globe, know it was Joe Biden, and that Australopithecus walked upright. And then there are a bunch of disgusting pieces of trash who are trying to turn back humanity a century or more, who loudly disagree with all the evidence. Then there are some people caught in the middle who believe the disgusting excuses for humanity, like Luskin, because of in-group bias or other biases, many of which all humans have. But in reality, there is no controversy about either. The first group of people are doing a good job and should keep it up. The second group should be relentlessly mocked, refused service by any business that pretends to care about things other than the bottom line, shunned by friends and family, exposed to the maximum extent possible, and made to fear leaving their homes as a result of the social stigma of having become pariahs. As for the third group, I'm not really sure. I was in that group for a good part of my life. They can be reached, but it takes care and compassion. But on the other hand, when they do things like refuse vaccines, things that directly harm people and even kill people, they cannot be excused for such behavior. Perhaps we need a way to help show them that they do not need to hold on to dangerous and harmful ideas in order to maintain their identity. Of course, clear science communication is also key, which is why I'm here.
There's an article in the journal Nature in 2000 that said that Lucy actually had the hand bones that were similar to a knuckle walker, like chimps and gorillas.
That paper is Evidence That Humans Evolved from a Knuckle-Walking Ancestor by Bria G. Richmond and David S. Straight. The body of the article entirely accepts that the earliest hominins then known were bipeds and offers no rebuttal to this. Instead, it is concerned with the locomotor methods of the common ancestor of humans and chimps primarily, and secondarily that of the common ancestor of humans, chimps, and gorillas. There is a small chance that he is instead referencing the much smaller and non-technical piece, "These fists were made for walking" by Henry G., but that includes the line, "Both Australopithecus alamensis and Afarensis, for example, were bipeds. They walked as upright as you or I, and probably not on their knuckles." So not exactly something that actually agrees with Luskin. Further, this argument that knuckle walking was common to the ancestors of gorillas and humans has not generally been accepted.
So that tells you a lot about how Lucy probably walked, at least when she was on the ground.
Nope, again, Luskin is lying because he's a far-right theocrat who cares more about hating gay people and enforcing Christian hegemony by law than about being truthful. In fact, the paper alluded to, but not cited, doesn't even make the claim that Australopithecus was knuckle walking. It maintains that they were in fact bipeds, but argues that they have retained a few traits of wrist anatomy from a knuckle-walking ancestor. If Luskin read this paper, then he's lying about it. If he's referencing it without having read it, then he's lying about having read it. Because referencing a source means you've read it at least enough to know what point it's making.
There's also quite a bit of evidence. This is from an article in the journal New Scientist. It said everything about her skeleton, from fingertips to toes, suggests several traits that would be very suitable for climbing in trees.
So again, Australopithecus is transitional, and that's a reason for Luskin to declare that it's not transitional. If humans evolved from apes, and apes are basically arboreal, then we should expect increased arboreality in the earliest human line animals. This is a prediction of evolution, not a problem for it.
So I think it's clear that Lucy also had an arboreal lifestyle.
Well, she was certainly more arboreal than a modern human, but we also know she inhabited broken woodlands, that is, small bits of forested terrain surrounded by grassland, and so couldn't be as arboreal as her ancestors.
Meaning that she spent a lot of time in trees.
That's true.
Now, what about her pelvis? The pelvis is a very important bone for determining how an organism walks. Do they walk upright, or are they quadrupedal, walking on all fours? Well, when Lucy's pelvis was first discovered, it was actually in very bad shape, and they had to do reconstruction. And there's been criticism that they reconstructed Lucy's pelvis so that it looked more human-like than it actually was.
Oh, there has been criticism. I like that nice passive wording here, where the criticism just seems to be in the air, floating around paleoanthropology. No indication of where it come from, how it was responded to, or whether it's valid. It's just something that has existed. In reality, this criticism is entirely pushed by pseudoscientists who want to push Australopithecus as a quadruped for dogmatic, not scientific reasons, and primarily not because they care about science, they clearly do not, but because they want to be able to tell you how to live your life. There is no scientific criticism of this reconstruction of Lucy's pelvis for two very obvious reasons. The first is that it was actually done rigorously and without any major methodological flaws. The second, and perhaps even more important reason, is that we have other pelvises and they were not so damaged, and did not require as much reconstruction, and they matched the reconstruction very well. Australopiths had the pelvises of upright walking apes, like humans do.
And various scientific papers have said that her pelvis was initially badly crushed with distortion and cracking, with air in the reconstruction, creating a very human-like sacral plane.
Fun how we don't actually get these papers named. You know why? Because they're primarily not papers. They're just fancy blog posts published in places controlled by human piles of feces like Luskin and his other trash compatriots like Gunter Beckley and Stephen Meyer.
And so basically, there was air in the way she was reconstructed. There was an article in the Journal of Human Evolution.
In extemporaneous casual speech in a casual setting, there's no expectation for formal citation and the like, and simply saying that there was a paper is probably fine. If you're questioned about that, you can go check. This is not casual or extemporaneous. These are prepared marks about a scientific topic. The only reason to not cite a paper and instead simply say, a paper, is if you're trying to conceal something. Casey Luskin is doing all he can to shout at you that he is not to be trusted and that he is a liar, short of stating it explicitly.
Which talked about how we really don't have enough evidence to clearly say how Lucy walked. It said, prevailing views of Lucy's posture are almost impossible to reconcile. To resolve such differences, more anatomical fossil evidence is needed. The available data at present are open to widely different interpretations.
That paper is the 1995 paper, Lateral View of Australopithecus afarensis, Primitive Aspects of Bipedal Position Behavior in the Earliest Hominids, by M. Maurice Abitbol, a gynecologist who was not and has never been a paleoanthropologist. It, like Luskin prefers, concentrates solely on Lucy and comes to conclusions that her posture may have been intermediate between that of chimpanzees and humans, Of course, in 1995, it might have been reasonable to concentrate just on the partial remains of one Australopithecus afarensis and come to a view that was fringe in 1995, and completely untenable in 2025, 30 years later, when most people will see this video. Whether Luskin cares to acknowledge it or not, we have other specimens with more complete pelvies and spines, and in fact they confirm the predictions of bipedality, no matter what a gynecologist from 3 decades ago said. Also, the paper says, quote, "The conclusion is that Lucy's erect posture is unlike that seen in modern humans and is still a mystery," end quote. Not exactly a resounding refutation of her bipedality.
There's an anthropologist from the UK who said,
yeah, well, there was an anthropologist from Venezuela who said that Casey Luskin likes to dress his male lovers in diapers and eat the shit out of their diapers before pissing into his own mouth. Then he goes out and molests chickens. See how easy it is to say things that, while at least possibly true, have no actual evidence and then just blame that on someone you didn't bother to name? That's why it's important to actually cite sources and not just be vague about it. Now, of course, I am not saying that any of that is true. All I have to go on is the word of an unnamed anthropologist from some country. That's not really evidence. While it's possibly true, it's not exactly as if I should rely on that, nor should you. But on the other hand, it's not like it would be the worst thing that could be said about Luskin, and some of the worst things are far worse and true.
that the Australopithecines are like apes.
They literally are apes. They're not any more or less apes than gorillas, and neither are modern humans. Sure, in common parlance we can exclude humans from the ape category and apes from the monkey category. But if we're going to talk about science, then it's a technical field, and what we are really talking about are taxonomic categories, and apes maps onto hominoidea, and both Australopithecus afarensis and Homo sapiens are firmly within that superfamily, and so are apes 100% and will never be not apes.
And the Homo group are like humans.
Wow! Such amazing insight. The members of a genus are all similar. Of course, the Homo group are also so like apes that they are apes.
Something major occurred when Homo evolved, and it wasn't just in the brain.
Yeah, that position is getting harder and harder to defend now that we have late Australopiths and early Homo, which are virtually indistinguishable to the point that there are current debates about which genus certain finds belong in.
So let's talk really briefly about what I like to call a Big Bang origin of the genus Homo.
I'd rather not, but I guess we have no choice.
When you read the technical literature,
you're supposed to cite it and not lie about it, something Luskin apparently missed. I guess he was out of class every time things like academic integrity came up.
you see that it talks about an explosion or rapid increase, punctuated change, and approximate doubling of brain size at the appearance of Homo around 2 million years ago. In fact, a study of the pelvises of the Australopithecines and Homo found very rapid evolution corresponding to the emergence of the genus Homo.
Fun fact, evidence of relatively rapid evolution is still evidence of evolution and the common ancestry of humans and other apes. It's like saying you don't have evidence that diamonds are made of carbon because labs that grow diamonds can do it fast. It makes no sense at all.
When you see buzzwords like punctuated change, explosion, rapid increase, very rapid evolution, what that means in the technical literature is we don't have transitional forms.
Yet another lie.
Things change so rapidly that we don't see an evolutionary gradual transition going on.
Except that we do. In fact, the transition is so smooth based on the fossils that we do have that it's not clear that we can really call it a transition at all, since it's just a continuation of trends seen throughout the evolution of hominins, not something new. That was the entire point of the paper From Australopithecus to Homo, The Transition That Wasn't, by William H. Kimball and Brian Vilmore. Here I will quote the conclusion of that paper. Quote, "The more we learn about early Homo, the less compelling is the case that an adaptive shift can be read from currently documented skull and skeletal anatomy as a major transition from generalized Australopithecus precursors. Early phylogenetically basal species of the Homo clade resemble generalized Australopiths more than they do later species of that clade. as expected from a Darwinian pattern of descent with modification. These and subsequent transitional species of the Homo lineage, for example, H. erectus, erode the impression of distinct adaptive suites created by comparisons between terminal taxa or those separated by large temporal gaps. The epigraph heading of this paper indicates that Darwin himself recognized this as a probable outcome of descent with modification, given a grown fossil record. The argument has recently been updated by Cartmill. This recognition is not, however, a pay into wholesale phyletic or gradual evolution in Homo, as was commonly asserted half a century ago. The African fossil record of Homo demonstrates diversity quite clearly between 2.0 and 1.7 million years ago, and there are hints of it as far back as 2.4 million years ago. It is rather an argument against adaptive unity as a biologically necessary adjunct to monophily in the definition of the genus category. Whether or not we choose to adopt the larger number of super-specific taxonomic ranks and their associated taxon names, dictated by a bushy hominin clade, is not a pressing scientific matter in the quest to understand human origins. Of greater importance can be counted recent arguments for the use or manufacture of stone tools in time periods predating by some 500,000 years the earliest Homo fossils known so far, and the potential they have to shrink the adaptive space between Homo and Australopithecus still further. Indeed, the expanded brain size, human-like wrist and hand anatomy, dietary eclecticism, and potential tool-making capabilities of generalized Australopithecus root the Homo lineage in ancient hominin adaptive trends, suggesting that the transition from Australopithecus to Homo may not have been that much of a transition at all. End quote.
In fact, look at this quote from Ernst Mayr, one of the great evolutionary biologists he was basically one of the architects of the modern neo-Darwinian synthesis. He said that the earliest fossils of Homo are separated from Australopithecus by a large unbridged gap. How can we explain this seeming saltation? He says, not having any fossils that can serve as missing links. We have to fall back on the time-honored method of historical science, the construction of a historical narrative.
Hey, Luskin finally actually named a name. That's neat. I still won't cite my source about Luskin's alleged coprophagy, though. Also, Meyer died 20 years ago, so we're definitely getting the cutting edge on this topic. This was a bit hard to track down. Searching for the quote only turned up creationist sources, and mostly Luskin sources, which is odd for a statement of the state of the field from a founding member of that field. It turns out that the only place I can find it is really, in fact, Luskin, who cites Ernst Mayr What Makes Biology Unique, Considerations of the Autonomy of a Scientific Discipline, published Cambridge, UK, Cambridge University Press, 2004, page 198. Mayr would almost certainly not say this now, since at this point the field has expanded so much that it's really the opposite, where we're not sure where to even draw a line between Australopithecus and Homo, which can be seen in the fact that creationists can't agree on which hominins are just apes, and which are fully human, and even the same creationists will come up with different answers on different days. Also, here's part of that Luskin didn't bother to quote. We have to make use of every conceivable clue to construct a probable scenario, and then test this explanation against the available evidence. This is what science is. You have a question, you use your prior knowledge from science to come up with an educated guess that becomes a hypothesis that you then test. Casey Luskin is complaining that paleoanthropology follows the scientific method. Mayr was not saying that we just make shit up and leave it. The making stuff up part is directly followed with investigation and hypothesis testing. Like in any science.
Isn't this interesting that one of the leading evolutionists says that we are not seeing fossils documenting this transition. Instead, we're separated by a large unbridged gap, and we don't have any fossils that can serve as quote-unquote missing links in his own words.
No, not really. If you took any field of research that's active here in the year of our Lord 2025, you'll find that 2 decades ago, we knew a lot less than we do now.
There's 3 Harvard paleoanthropologists who discussed the transition from Australopithecus to Homo. And they had both good news and bad news. We'll start with the bad news. They said the transition from Australopithecus to Homo was undoubtedly one of the most critical in its magnitude and consequences.
Back to unnamed sources, huh? Well, I heard from 3 detectives that Casey Luskin is wanted for crimes against children in Thailand. Now what? Hey, Discovery Institute shitbags. I know you watch my stuff. Gunter Beckley's petulant whining about me makes that clear. If you don't want me to keep associating you with stuff like this, stuff which may or may not be completely made up, and which I don't personally believe, but could be true, maybe you should get your boy Luskin to actually cite his sources.
As with many key evolutionary events, there is both good news and bad news. First, the bad news is that many of the details of this transition are obscure because of the paucity of the fossil and archaeological records. Okay, so they don't know how this transition happens. That's the bad news. Okay, then what is the good news? Well, here's what they say. Although we lack many details about exactly how, when, and where the transition occurred from Australopithecus to Homo. We have sufficient data from both before and after the transition to make some inferences about the overall nature of key changes that did occur.
So, once again, even if this is a real thing that paleoanthropologists said, it means that paleoanthropology is a science. It's learning new things and testing hypotheses. And given the antiquity of the other things he's alluded to, which I've bothered to hunt down despite the fact that he didn't bother to cite them, I suspect this too is decades out of date. Frankly, I'm tired of doing Luskin's work for him. I'm just going to say that until Luskin bothers to cite this source, he made it up. Like how he allegedly made up that candy that he maybe used to allegedly lure children to his alleged hut in Thailand. An accusation which I do not believe, but which again is made on as much authority as this quote Luskin is giving us.
So what are they saying here? They're saying, in other words, the fossil record provides ape-like Australopithecines before and human-like Homo after this supposed transition.
Yes, in line with predictions that go all the way back to Darwin.
But not actual fossils documenting a transition between them. And in the absence of intermediates, we're left with inferences of a transition that are based strictly upon the assumption of evolution.
Yeah, 20 years ago. And those attempts to fill in the gap with evolutionary theory have since proved successful, with discoveries based on such hypotheses of animals who do indeed fill the gap. Organisms like Australopithecus sediba, which wasn't described until 2010, and about which there is still argument about whether it should be Homo sediba or Australopithecus sediba. And of course, Luskin has had plenty of time to update his talking points to be relevant to the current state of the field. But that would be inconvenient to his grift, so he doesn't.
Getting back to this paper in Molecular Biology and Evolution.
What paper?
It said that early Homo was significantly and dramatically different from Australopithecines.
Searching for that phrase in quotes brings up literally only one link, to a transcript of this very talk that itself is a broken link. So Casey, you sure it was a paper? You sure it wasn't nothing?
In virtually every element of its skeleton and every remnant of its behavior. The changes are sudden. No Australopithecine species is obviously transitional. A radical transformation, in other words, a genetic revolution.
Well, I can see why Luskin didn't bother to cite this. This is from a paper published in 2000 by John Hawkes. Luckily for us, Hawkes wrote a blog post responding to this use of his paper by creationists. It's called What Do We Know About the Ancestry of Homo erectus? And is linked in the description, and I will now quote from it extensively. Quote, I know I have a lot of readers who have run across selective quotation before. It's a common and obviously misleading tactic. Take a long passage and quote a single sentence out of context. In this case, the sentence on its own seems to suggest that our species, Homo sapiens, did not evolve in a gradual series of changes from earlier populations of Australopithecus. You might guess from the word Australopithecine that this is a fairly old quote, and indeed it comes from one of my, Hawkes, first academic articles, published in 2000. The fossil evidence for human evolution has grown a lot since then. So what was the broader context of this quote, and what do I think today? The quote comes from an article titled Population Bottlenecks and Pleistocene Human Evolution. In the article, we considered an emerging understanding from human genetics at that time. Today's humans throughout the world came from a population that for most of the Pleistocene was quite limited in genetic variation. The data on human genetic variation was beginning to build in the 1970s and 1980s. The low genetic variation must reflect repeated population bottlenecks, not only in humans, but in many other species also. The geneticists Rebecca Kane, Mike Stoneking, and Alan Wilson in 1987 found that human mitochondrial DNA had exceptionally low variation and a common ancestor within the last 200,000 years, prompting the idea that every bit of the genetic ancestry of today's people came from African ancestral groups in that short time. But by the late 1990s, Henry Harpending, Alan Rogers, and other human geneticists had shown that the mitochondrial story was paralleled by nuclear DNA on a much longer timescale. Their work suggested that factors extending across the last million years or more must have been at play. This is where I, Hawkes, entered the story. In that 2000 paper, we wanted to see whether the fossil and archaeological records might align with this genetic evidence for longer-term constraints on variation. In that era, paleoanthropologists had come to see early Homo erectus as a big departure from every earlier hominin. The species had larger bodies, taller stature, larger brains. It was the first human relative to strike out from its African homeland. It seemed to have changes in its diet, home range, and technology. These concepts followed after the discovery of the Turkana boy. Earlier scientists thought about an orderly sequence from Australopithecus to Homo habilis to Homo erectus, then ultimately onward to us. But by the 1990s, it seemed that H. erectus was as old as the oldest Homo habilis fossils, or even older. And while the fossils of H. habilis weren't great, that species itself seemed pretty much like Australopithecus in its small body size, short stature, fairly big molars, and ratio of arm to leg length. So we thought, what if the first appearance of H. erectus was a rapid event? What would that look like? In the following passage, we use the name early Homo sapiens instead of Homo erectus because at the time we argued that the lineage did not have later speciations that split it into different species. It's a long story. The anatomy of the earliest H. sapiens sample indicates significant modifications of the ancestral genome and is not simply an extension of evolutionary trends in an earlier Australopithecine lineage throughout the Pliocene. In fact, its combination of features never appears earlier. Some of its characteristics are unique, such as the very large body sizes and long legs described below, while others can be found in isolation in various different Pliocene and Pena-contemporary hominid species. If we assume these early Australopithecines are a group of very closely related species, for instance, nearer to each other than Pan and Homo, we can expect that they differ much more in allele frequencies than in the presence or absence of specific genes for these features. Therefore, reshuffling of existing alleles could result in the frequencies of features we observed in early H. sapiens. Thus, our second question is about this reshuffling, whether H. sapiens is a consequence of rapid speciation with significant founder effect, or the result of a long gradual process of anagenic change. The first explanation, cladogenesis, is suggested by the fact that no gradual series of changes in earlier Australopithecine populations clearly leads to the new species, and no Australopithecine species is obviously transitional. This may seem to be an unexpected statement, because for 3 decades habiline species have been interpreted as being just such transitional taxa, linking Australopithecus through the habilines to later Homo species. But with a few exceptions, the known habiline specimens are now recognized to be less than 2 million years old, and therefore are too recent to be transitional forms leading to H. sapiens. So there's the full context for that quote from the beginning of the post. Our idea was to explain how a rapid change might have brought about the combination of features found in Homo erectus for the first time. Maybe an initially small population of Australopithecus-like species had started rapidly adapting to new circumstances. At first, it wouldn't be much different from other kinds of Australopithecus, and most of the first set of changes would result from random genetic drift in a small population. But if some of the changes happened to click with the environment, natural selection would kick in. If you looked at the resulting population after the fact, you would not find very many features that align closely with the ancestral form of Australopithecus. The ancestral features would be more of a mosaic, some resembling one species, maybe Homo habilis, some resembling another, maybe Homo rudolfensis or Australopithecus africanus, but most seeming pretty new. The main genetic pattern you would notice was a lot of drift across the genome reflecting the population bottleneck. Our interpretation is that the changes are sudden and interrelated and reflect a bottleneck that was created because of the isolation of a small group of parent Australopithecine species. In this small population, a combination of drift and selection resulted in a radical transformation of allele frequencies, fundamentally shifting the adaptive complex. In other words, a genetic revolution. A lot has changed in the fossil record during the last 24 years. For one thing, we know more about the diversity of early hominins. About 2 million years ago, when H. erectus was making its first appearance in South Africa, the same region was home to Australopithecus sediba. That species is like Homo habilis in a lot of ways, from body size, arm length relative to leg length, and tooth sizes, with a more human-like hand than H. habilis, a pelvis resembling H. erectus in some ways, but brain size and other features like Australopithecus africanus. In other words, it also seemed like a mosaic that combines features found in other species, including later ones. Meanwhile, the fossil picture of Homo erectus has also changed. More fossils now document the first 500,000 years of its evolution. From its first appearances at Drimmel in South Africa, and Garba, Ethiopia, just around 2 million years ago, up to the Turkana skeleton around 500,000 years ago. Most informative is the fossil sample from Debunking, Republic of Georgia, which includes 5 skulls and at least 2 partial postcranial skeletons. Those fossils do not share the very tall stature that was estimated for the Turkana, and they have brain sizes in the same range as Homo habilis, not like the much larger Turkana. With these discoveries, the early evolution of H. erectus no longer looks like a sudden pulse of evolution of body, brain, and behavior. If you put these early H. erectus fossils next to H. habilis, H. rudolfensis, and Australopithecus sediba, the patchwork of their features seems like a group of Dungeons & Dragons players rolled dice to pick the strengths of their characters. Of course, the most important new information during the last decade has been the ancient DNA record. There is no ancient DNA for Homo erectus yet, nor for any other hominin fossil older than early Neanderthalensis from Cima de los Huesos, Spain. We have learned enough from later human groups, including Neanderthals and Denisovans, to see how important mixture was to their evolution. This picture is confirmed by DNA studies of non-human primates, most of whom today have deep population lineages that were connected from time to time by gene flow. Ideas about the first appearance of Homo have changed a lot over time. From the 1960s to the 1990s, most researchers thought of an Australopithecus species evolving into Homo habilis, and thence onward to Homo erectus. The classic March of Progress painting by Rudolf Zallinger illustrates exactly this picture. Then, in the 1990s, many researchers came to accept that H. habilis and the similar H. rudolfensis were much more like Australopithecus in their body size, shape, and behavior than Homo erectus. The ideas of a simultaneous shift in body size, brain size, diet, and technology took root. The appearance of Homo erectus seemed to be one of the major transitions of our evolutionary history. Returning to the subject of this post, how do we look at this transition today? The idea of a big shift from an unknown Australopithecus-like species to Homo erectus has given way to an understanding that none of these hominins around 2 million years ago were very different from each other. Australopithecus and their close relatives were much more human-like, and Homo erectus much more Australopithecus-like than it once seemed. If this were a Pleistocene version of Ancestry.com, we still cannot say exactly which form of Australopithecus or its relatives gave rise to Homo erectus. But that's no longer a central goal for understanding the evolution of our genus. Both Australopithecus sediva and Homo habilis show something about what the transition from early hominin anatomical patterns to Homo erectus may have looked like. These species were very close to each other, certainly diverging within a few 100,000 years from a common ancestor. That makes them as close as modern people, Denisovans and Neanderthals, were to each other. What we know from DNA about the interbreeding of later human relatives must have been true of early Pleistocene ones. When they met, they would have exchanged some traits and behaviors along with genes. Just like modern-day genealogy discoveries, the ancestor of Homo erectus might be all of the above. As I, Hawks, read through the original 2000 paper now, I think we were on the right track with the core idea, reshuffling of the standing genetic variation among closely related populations that were subject to strong genetic drift. Whole genomes have brought about the understanding that most human traits are highly polygenic, and natural selection on traits acts upon standing genetic variation much more rapidly than new mutations can arise. As local populations of Australopithecus species came to differ from each other in allele frequencies, they would explore a substantial space of phenotypic variation. Add in the fact that they sometimes met and exchanged genes, and you have a scenario where the anatomical features of species might come to look like reshuffled versions of each other. This will put random chance near the top of the reasons for the evolution of Homo erectus as we know it. I'm sure that nobody will pick up that last sentence and take it out of context. End quote. I have very lightly edited the blog post for brevity, although I suspect that I have failed at that task. Either way, please visit the original post. It's linked in the description. It's the link that goes to johnhawks.net. So it seems Luskin is lying again.
This is not what you want, just for the record, if you're an evolutionist. This is the exact opposite of what you want to find in the fossil record.
Well, good thing we found a lot more in the 2.5 decades since this cherry-picked source was written.
But a commentator talking about this evidence actually called this a Big Bang theory of human evolution.
Well, a commentator once told me that he had seen Casey Luskin feasting on the raw flesh of sex workers he'd killed in a basement dungeon in Nevada. Now, am I saying that Casey Luskin is a shit-eating cannibalistic child predator and murderer? Well, no, of course not. But I've heard it said that he is.
And this problem is all throughout the hominid fossil record. A major 2015 review of hominid evolution said,
is citing sources properly against Luskin's religion? This is from Macroevolution in and around the hominin clade from the book Macroevolution, and was written by Bernard Wood and Mark Grabowski.
The evolutionary sequence for the majority of hominin lineages is unknown. Most hominin taxa, particularly early hominins, have no obvious ancestors, and in most cases, ancestor-descendant sequences, fossil time series, cannot be reliably constructed.
Well, at least that's what I thought it was from. It had the same topic, it was the right year, it was a review, but I can't find any of these quotes here. So, Luskin, where did you get this? It seems like you made it up, because remember, you can't be well-informed, honest, and a creationist. You have to at most choose two of those, and we can tell Luskin hasn't chosen honest.
Okay, so we have this major gap in the fossil record.
Except that we don't, and even the author of one of Luskin's uncited works disagrees, and objects to this very characterization of his now outdated work.
This large unbridged gap, right when the human-like body plan is supposed to be evolving from its ape-like Australopithecine ancestors. But when we look at the genus Homo, what we see is that in contrast to the Australopithecines and other hominids, the major members of Homo, like Homo erectus and Neanderthals, are very similar to modern humans.
And others, like Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis, are more similar to late members of Australopithecus. But I guess they're not major members of genus Homo, whatever the fuck that means. I guess it's just a weasel term that Luskin is using to try to dismiss very real forms he says don't exist. Because get this, Luskin is a liar who probably doesn't eat shit from diapers, eat human flesh, or harm children, but whom sources say does.
In fact, they're so similar to us that some have classified Homo erectus and the Neanderthals as members of our own species, Homo sapiens.
Who, Casey? Who has done that? Because as near as I can tell, it's just liar creationists like Luskin himself. But that's okay, because some have said that Luskin's parents died under mysterious circumstances, and he inherited a lot from that. I'm not going to say who said it, nor do I believe it to be true, but, some sources have said it.
These other hominids are very similar to modern humans. When you look at a comparison of the skulls of Homo erectus, Neanderthals, and Homo sapiens, there are some differences, but overall they're very, very similar.
Well, they're very close related, and their similarity to modern humans is literally the reason they're in genus Homo. Remember earlier when Casey was complaining that our earliest hominins were too primitive, and I pointed out that that's exactly what evolution would require? Well, this is just the opposite end of that spectrum. The latest non-Homo sapiens hominins are now too human? Well, we'd expect the closest relatives of modern humans to be a lot like modern humans. If not, that would be a violation of the expectations of evolutionary biology. Luskin really likes to pretend that things that are predicted by evolution are actually problems for evolution when they're found.
When you look at skull size, Neanderthals actually had an average skull size that is greater than that of modern humans.
That's true.
And even though the average skull size of Homo erectus is smaller than modern humans, it's still well within the range of modern human genetic variation.
Yeah, pathological variation. But I don't think we want to count birth defects and genetic diseases when we define species. H. erectus' brain was far smaller than any healthy H. sapiens brain, both in terms of absolute size and proportionality. And because pathologies in modern humans that result in tiny brains, like hydrocephaly, also cause other identifiable changes, we can tell that H. erectus wasn't a diseased human. That's the normal size for their brains. Once again, Luskin is lying, and I can tell because he's obviously read literature in the field of paleoanthropology, or at least claims to have done so, but what he's saying is in fact the opposite of what his sources indicate.
So it's not outside the range of what we would consider to be normal for human beings.
Yes, it absolutely is, and you can tell because it's given its own specific designation with its own anatomical criteria for assigning specimens to the species.
But various paleoanthropologists have recognized that that Neanderthals were very similar to modern humans.
Yeah, in the same way that coyotes and Ethiopian wolves are very similar to gray wolves. They're basically sister species. That's what we should expect. Neanderthals were so similar to modern humans that the two could at least sometimes produce fertile offspring, although it seems that there were some barriers, as evidenced by the fact that we seem to have no evidence of the Neanderthal Y chromosome entering the genetic pool of any H. sapiens population.
One says they may have had heavier brows or broader noses or stockier builds, but behaviorally, socially, and reproductively, they were just people.
I guess it depends on your criteria for personhood, but yeah, I've long been of the opinion that if modern humans were to encounter living Neanderthals today, that their personhood would probably be swiftly recognized and that they would be treated as persons both legally and morally. I think capturing them and forcing them to do work would be slavery in a way it's not for, say, horses or cattle, and that using them for experiments in the way we might a more distantly related monkey would constitute torture and false imprisonment. Neanderthals weren't the same as modern humans, but they were extremely similar, and that's not a controversial statement, or one that in any way is a problem for the general story of human evolution. That humans had sister species is pretty normal for evolution. It's actually the current situation in which there is only one hominin species, which is really weird.
Another archaeologist says Neanderthals were using technology as advanced as that of contemporary anatomically modern humans and using symbolism in much the same way.
It's not so clear with the symbolism. They seem to have made some basic jewelry and etched hatch marks into rocks, but they weren't producing cave art like we see in known Homo sapiens locations. They weren't blowing ochre onto walls with their hands in the way to make handprints, they weren't making elaborate nature scenes full of realistic pictures of the animals they encountered in their daily lives, etc. That's not to say they were incapable of it. I don't know if they were capable of it, but we don't have any evidence for such symbolic art.
So contrary to the perceptions and claims by some evolutionists, Neanderthals do not show that humans are descended from or related to primitive and or ape-like species.
Yeah, and they show evolution within the hominin clade, though. I can't express in words the degree to which nothing he's saying right now matters at all to the claim that humans share common ancestry with other apes.
In fact, there are fossils showing morphological mosaics suggesting that modern humans and Neanderthals interbred, and there's also genetic studies showing that modern humans have what they call Neanderthal DNA.
Yep.
So what? Isn't it odd that when Luskin is finally broadly honest and accurate, it doesn't help his case in the least?
So what's really the difference between us and them? I would say that they could be viewed as just a subrace of the human species who lived in a particular part of the world at a certain time, and they were just as human as you and me. That's one way to look at them.
Or we could look at them through the lens of genetic studies, because we've sequenced their genomes several times over, and they're genetically, morphologically, and ecologically distinct species, which means that by virtually every species concept known to biology, they were a different species to Homo sapiens. But again, so the f*** what?
The differences between these human-like members of Homo can be explained as microevolutionary changes, not macroevolution.
Macroevolution is evolution at or above the species level. Since Homo erectus, H. neanderthalensis, etc. were different species, this is definitionally macroevolution, not microevolution. Casey is just lying about what macroevolution is.
What I would say, there's a good quote from one scientist who called it the effects of size variation.
Yeah, well, I heard from one scientist that the size of Casey Luskin's rather pathetic intromittent organ is far too small to be included in the normal variation of humans, and he invented the term nanopenis to describe it. I don't plan to check to see if that's true, but one scientist said it. But you know what? That's about all I can take from this alleged shit-eater cannibal with a penis it would take a scanning electron microscope to see. I'm done for now. We'll pick back up with this alleged quote from one scientist next time. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Tovend, Ferrevara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Eleron Teller, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostick Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babdy, Wallace, Max Cherry, North Texas Fossils, John Ackerman, and Strawberry Vein. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.